I was at a conference in the UK, and I actually said to people, "Do you know where your data is?" And a lot of them would just look at you like a deer in the headlights. They just stare at you with a blank stare because they really truly don't know.
Cost savings look great and outsourcing promises significant efficiencies. But who really controls your data, your access, and your resilience? To discuss these risks and the opportunities, I'm joined by Tom Garrubba. He's a leading expert in third party risk, in external party assurance, supply governance, and cyber risk management. He's the co founder and chief commercial officer at Fusion Air. That's an agentic AI powered assurance response software company. And in today's conversation, I'm really looking forward to discussing third party risks and why this really matters to boards today and how organizations should be managing their supply dependencies, their offshore delivery, and what good governance looks like, especially when we're talking about critical technology and especially when it's being delivered and supported across borders, including major delivery locations like the USA, Europe, and increasingly in India. So, Tom, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thank you, Dominic. Great to be here.
Whereabouts in the world are you, Tom?
I'm in the US. I'm in a city called Pittsburgh, which is on the East Coast.
Well, look, thanks very much for coming on the podcast today. I mean, third party risk, it moves so far beyond just procurement and contract management. And you've spent years working with different organizations, understanding and managing the risks that sit beyond their own walls. You know, doesn't mean it's beyond their own responsibility or it's beyond what impacts their company, but that companies, their suppliers, their subcontractors, the cloud platforms, these offshore delivery teams that just sit outside of their organization structure. So when you speak with boards, when you're speaking with executives, how do you explain that difference, Tom? And why does it matter when you consider the risks and how we manage a supplier contract successfully as opposed to when things are managed in-house?
Sure. I would venture to say now 90% of organizations in some way, shape, or form are using third party providers. What a lot of organizations have failed to really do for many, many years, and this has changed rapidly over the last 5 to 10 years, is looking at the controls. They basically assumed that the vendor that I'm doing business with is going to have the same controls as me. And of course, that's not to be the case. And that's why you started seeing a lot of things with respect to data privacy, data security, DPSAs, actually, when you put them together, privacy and security addendums. Um, I see a lot of organizations, and this is what I've cautioned a lot of organizations on, is they think once they sign a DPSA, and affix it to their contract as an addendum. Oh, we're fine, we're covered. The problem is if you enter into a 3-year agreement and they only sign that one time at the onset of the contract, you can be going into year 2 and year 3, and now you're implementing multi-factor authentication. Now you're using a different form of encryption. Now you might turn around and say, well, we used to allow offshoring in, say, China or the Philippines, and now we're not doing that anymore. And if you don't share that with the vendor, and more importantly, you don't update your data privacy and security addendum and get them to sign off on it, then you're really holding yourself at risk. And not just at risk, but all the legal ramifications that can go with that. So, what I tried to do is I was at a conference in the UK of about 4 or 5 years ago, and I actually said to people, "Do you know where your data is?" And a lot of them would just look at you like, as we say in the US, like a deer in the headlights. They just stare at you with a blank stare because they really truly don't know all of the places where their data is with their third parties. So if I can help them start to think along those lines and maybe do an internal inventory of, hey, where is all of our stuff? Um, the beauty of it is particularly in Europe with the general data protection regulation, and here in the US with some of those privacy laws, it's the privacy laws that really started to push things more and saying you need to have an inventory of where your data is. Okay. And even if it's going to India for processing or the Philippines or Jakarta, any of these other places, you have to have an understanding of what the data, how many records, what type of data it is. And you have to make sure that you are comfortable with the overall controls that they have in place. And so you really have to do your due diligence.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Doing that due diligence is critical, and many organisations are relying on large technology providers because they offer that scale, often that expertise, and generally the number one criteria, sadly, is still costs. Now, I'm wondering at what point. Now, we talk about strategic supply concentration, and in Europe we have DORA, which is really strong legislation, and that specifically talks about concerns and risk management when it comes to concentration risk. But at the end of the day, no one is going to outsource to IT providers in order to diversify their risk. So, how do organizations manage that when they look? They've got a strategic supplier, and it is unquestionably a concentration risk. What are the warning signs they should look for, and how do they manage that?
That's one of the $1,000,000 questions, if I can bring that up. It's finding the balance. There is literally a balance between, as you decrease your concentration risk, your vendor risk goes up. When you decrease your vendor risk, your concentration risk goes up. So you need to find a balance of where the organization is comfortable with that. And Dominic, the other thing that a lot of people fail to do is they're so focused on the production data, they totally forget to include their test and QA environments. And their test and QA environments, I don't care what anybody says, a lot of organizations still to this day utilize production data in a test and QA environment without the identifying it or doing any type of scrubbing of that data.
Mm,
And I've talked to friends of mine who are hackers, and one of the biggest wake up calls I got was one of the hackers said, "When I want to break into a system, I go into the test and QA environment." I said, "Why do you do
mm,
that?" He goes, "Because they don't have all the locks and the guards and the alarms going off. That's all
mm,
surrounding the production data." And he goes, 9 times out of 10, I can go in and tap into a QA um, area or tap into a test environment and go, everything I need is right here. People are so focused on the production data. Make sure you ask the questions around test and QA data as well.
That's a great point, Tom. I think if you learn nothing else from today's conversation, I think that in itself is something worth checking. And when we look at the regulations, and when organisations are considering moving critical IT infrastructure or support or services from their home country, or moving it internally to an offshore model or some sort of a hybrid model, which is very, very common, especially in Europe. You talked about due diligence, but what should these companies that are considering that process, what should they be requiring from their supplier in order to make an informed decision?
You know, eh, let's be honest, everything comes down to cost. But when you're looking for protections, I think it's very important that you understand the legal ramifications. Are you able to, what recourse or how can the vendor work with you if they're outside of your jurisdiction? And I'm talking in your space outside of the EU, right? If they're doing something in Vietnam or China, etc. Um, those authorities are pretty good at cracking down if something was to go bad, or your government reaches out to them for assistance. But what you need to do too is I would tell people that you should be visiting your most critical vendors at least once every 2 to 3 years. But how oftentimes do organizations move where your data is being housed or produced, and they're moving it, even if it's across town? A lot of people don't do that. Let me give you an example of what happened, Dominic, when I was running the program at at the healthcare company I was at. I got a call from the CISO, and the CISO said, "Hey, Tom, I'm going to send you a contract. Let's look at it together." So we looked at it together. His name was Frank, and I said, "Frank, what am I looking for?" He said, "Do a search on China." I said, "Nothing." He said, "Do a search on Shanghai." I said, "Nothing." I said, "What's going on, Frank?" He says, "This was my fear." He said, "We had a third party, but we have a vendor who was doing work for us in India, and without telling us, they moved it into China." And how we found out was a very astute programmer based in the US who was working with the third party team had a conversation. They said, "Oh, yeah, well, let me reach out to the guys in Shanghai." And he said, "Wait, what do you mean Shanghai?" And that's when he found out this whole scope of work for about 5, 6 months was actually moved in. And then what happened then was we forced them. We were on calls. We forced them, and the CISO basically said, "You have 90 days to move everything back to its original place in think it was in Bangalore, India, back to the data center. He revised the data privacy and security addendum, which actually now says, here is where my data is. You're going to sign off on this. And he took it down to server farm on the in the building and on the floor and said, if you're even going to move this from one rack to another rack, you got to have my sign off. And he was so aggravated by what happened, he actually forbade them to bid on any future scopes of work for 2 years. Now, if you're the partner, the third party partner on that one, how do you explain that to your upper management? That I'm not permitted to bid on any more new scopes of work for this big dog healthcare company because of what I did. Dominic, I can tell you this, a lot of corporations at their peril hide behind the contract. You can't do that. You have to do your due diligence. I've seen so many companies that sit there and go, well, if they violate my contract, I'm going to sue them. What good is suing them when you're already in the London Times, the Wall Street Journal? People hear about the data breach. It's too late.
No, it really is. There's no excuse. And when you think about these contracts that are usually worth millions, or for small contracts they're worth hundreds of thousands, a due diligence task that might take $5,000, $10,000 to go and conduct the work, and people are like, oh, we don't have time, oh, we don't have the budgets. How is that not included in the budget to be doing physical on-site due diligence at least once a quarter, or if there's a reason why you might want to extend that to every 6 months? But I just don't understand. When you're spending this much on outsourcing, and you've sold it as a
Yes.
cost saving, and then you didn't put a cost budget in there for someone either externally or internally to do that. It really doesn't make sense. And you spoke about India, you spoke about China, and I think India is clearly one of the world's most important IT and
Yeah.
business services delivery locations. And when we look at it from a third party risk perspective, what should organizations be assessing before they lean on it? Because there's that level of reassurance that everyone's outsourcing to India today, it must be fine. But what do you think organizations should specifically be looking at when they're considering outsourcing IT operations?
But the first thing they should probably consider, once they understand what data they're going to be in possession of, that they're going to be offshoring to India, if they're going to be in possession of personally identifiable information, strategic data, intellectual property, or this is, your crown jewel data, as they would say, ask them for what do they have implemented in terms of a clean room. You have to implement some type of a clean room there where they're interfacing directly with your organization, and everything they do is monitored, everything is reviewed. And that's the other thing, a lot of people in at the vendors, they don't have somebody actually reviewing it. One of the great things that we did at the time, and believe it or not, I got these reports along with the business unit, was anytime somebody was assigned to the project, regardless of what level it was, hey Tom, are you okay with this individual? Okay, what are they doing? Okay, this person's coming on, these two people are coming off. And they would actually send us on a monthly basis, here's the user access, here are the people that have access to your systems. And they would provide us with the names and say, we had to sign off as a client. I think it's very important, and I'm going to share this story because I think this is where SOC 2 reports miss a lot of things. Okay, and this is why I've driven the point home so many times, Dominic, with respect to go visiting your vendor. I was over there visiting the CVS Health, and when I was over there, I was there getting a tour of the facility, and if you've ever been to these places, they're huge, right? They got like 50, 60 people on the floor. And for those of you who haven't been there, let me just give a little bit of description. When you're on there, it's almost like going to a conference vendor floor. So when I walked into our area, they said, this is where we're doing the work for CVS. And there was about 10 to 15 people doing the work. You could see the CVS promos. You could see, any of our logos and all that stuff. And I'm looking at this and I turn and I look, and right across from them is a competitor of ours. They're doing work for a competitor. And I said, why are we in the same space as them? I see the people talking to each other. They're printing to the same printers. And I said, no, this can't be. Based on the scope of work, I was not comfortable with this. So I took it back to management. The business unit was not happy. And the reason why the business unit was not happy was Our chief privacy officer agreed with me, along with the CISO, that said we need to move these people to a place, be in such close proximity with a direct competitor. And they did that. This is part of assurance. We have to make sure that our data is not going to be compromised, even through physical contact. So you're not going to get that out of a SOC 2 report. You're not going to get that out of a typical audit report. They're going to say, yes, we have these controls. So until you physically see it, you're not going to be able to make those subtle adjustments that and subtle call outs that really can make a difference.
And that call outs can only occur if you are doing good supplier assurance. So I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that, Tom. But
Sure.
before we do, I'll just remind our listeners that the International Risk Podcast is always available on YouTube. So please go to YouTube and search for the International Risk Podcast. And please do, if you like our content, subscribe and like it. It really is critical for our success. And maybe even think about that one friend that would really appreciate today's conversation and share it with them as well. But Tom, I'm wondering, is it enough? I mean, you talked about doing a physical on-site inspection, and you clearly found some issues there. But what about reviewing certifications and policies? Do you require, when you're doing good assurance, do you require subcontractors to provide evidence such as access logs, incident history, business continuity test results, not just continuity plans, but actual
Yeah.
test results, staff turnover data? We know in places like India, you mentioned Bangalore. We know the staff turnover in Bangalore is just huge. It is really, really high levels of turnover. Different control performance metrics. What does good supplier assurance look like?
I think what it is too is, at the same time, Dominic, it's how much time do I have? And that's the problem. I mean, nothing's worse than having to sit there and say, it's taken 6 weeks to do our vendor due diligence. We want to be thorough, but there is a point of diminishing returns. And that diminishing return is actually impeding the business from getting this project moving, or for getting the business up and running. So what you have to do is you have to have a game plan in advance. And I've always used the tactic of basing it off the data. It's dependent on the data. If they're getting this type of data, this is the level of due diligence we do. If they're just getting basic PII, like, I'm going to just do this, is going to be my due diligence. Cardholder data, personally identifiable information with health information records. You have to plan out what you're going to do from your due diligence. So it's important to have that rule book up front. The other thing that's important is making sure that the vendor is going to be able to live up to your expectation. And you have to be open with them. What we've done is we would tell the vendors up front, we're having our kickoff date here. We're going to give you our questionnaire. My team's going to do their assessment. It takes them 2 weeks. We're going to write up a report. We'll have a closing meeting, just like an audit. Anything we find gives you the opportunity to bring up, discuss, and then I'm going to turn this report over to the executives. We had what was called a vendor review committee, and it consisted of the chief information officer, chief risk officer, privacy officer, CISO, etc. And all of them had to sign off on it, all of them. So there was not a majority rule here. So there were times where my staff would come up to me and go, Tom, I've been waiting 2 weeks for this, 3 weeks for this, and I still haven't gotten anything. What do I do? And what I would do is I would reach out to the vendor, copy the business unit executive, and then copy the VP of procurement and say, we had this kickoff. You guys haven't provided us X. We are behind on this. And I said, you have until X day to give us this information, or I'm authorizing sourcing and procurement to withhold any and all funds due to your organization. Threaten the financial spigot and then watch everything roll in. But like I said about the partnerships and the relationships I had in the organization, that wasn't just some blind email that I sent out. I actually sat with the VP and said, look, we need to do this because we are putting ourselves at risk. We just can't continue to just, oh, well, it's week 7. We're not there yet. We can't do that because we're holding up the business line. I actually had one individual, this one VP reached out to me and said, Tom, we got to do this kickoff now. I mean, we got to do this now. We completely forgot we had to go through this assessment program. What should I do? And we actually crafted an internal legal document that allowed the business unit to move forward while we were giving them the data while we're doing our assessment. However, if we find anything that raises a major eyebrow to us, we reserve the right to sever the transactional data going back and forth between the organizations. And they would sign off on it. So, it's again, it's a relationship. It's all about relationships.
And before we even get into those relationships, as we've already touched on a few times, when outsourcing decisions are made, usually it's based on really visible cost savings. But the risks can sometimes be harder to quantify. Money coming in and out, we see that instantly. That's something we all understand from a very young age. But quantifying risks, it's like insurance, of course. It's quite hard to
Yeah.
quantify the risk that we've managed to avoid. So how do you advise organizations to build a really honest, risk adjusted business case that includes the governance, the audit, the resilience, the transition, ability to exit, and of course, if there's failures? So, how do organizations, genuinely and honestly come up with a real business case that does consider the risks as well as the cost savings?
One of the things that I've always looked at when you're looking at the entire risk picture, right? You have to break them down and you have to weigh each one. Cybersecurity risk, ESG risk. All of these risks, the financial risks, regulatory risk, all of these come down and funnel into reputation risk. A lot of people will place reputation risk funnels into finance. No, it's financial risk. No, it's the other way around. Because financial risk is something that if you really look at it, you can turn that around in a short period of time. Reputation stays with you for a long time. It can even be generational, which is detrimental to an organization. And tying that in is your reactionary time. If something goes awry, what is your reactionary time? And that's why it's so important to make sure that you build, your response into how you're going to handle certain things. But what I would recommend is taking those various types of risk and weighing them. One of the things that we did in our early stages is when we utilized the SIG questionnaire was we weighted each section, you know, access controls, privacy, business continuity and recovery, cloud on the way down the line. And we knew by that weighted score how we got the overall picture that we were comfortable with. And guess what? Every year we redid that activity. There was one time when I was running a program, there was more emphasis on human resources, on HR, because we were seeing that our vendors were not doing proper background checks on their employees. Very hard to do that in countries that are outside our regions, meaning the US and Europe. Okay. And I'm sure if you go to, whether you go to India, whether you go to Indonesia, the Philippines, etc., a lot of these individuals are hopping from one company to the next, or they may come in and these people probably shouldn't have access. If somebody for some reason was denied a visa to leave the country that they are in, isn't that a red flag? Why are they working on this project? You really have to take a look at the risk and say, what is the most important component here, or what is the barrier that could prevent this from moving forward? Because ultimately, you got to protect your company. But then again, like I said before, there's a point of diminishing returns. You don't want to hold up a project or an engagement because of something.
And help us understand when you talk about weighting these risks. How do we do
Mhm.
that? What does that actually look like? Are we talking about allocating a potential cost to these risks, or potential delay in programming, or look, how do we actually weigh them? What does that look like for our listeners that don't work in quality assurance or governance, or they're not working in risk management? What should they be thinking of when they hear you say that we've got to weight these different risks?
Dominic, how we rated it, we based it off of what kind of data is it? How many records? Okay. There's a big difference between a data breach of 10,000 records and 10 million records. But what type of record? If it was 10,000 email addresses, that's one thing. But if it's 10,000 credit card records, oh, we got a bigger problem. Or 10,000 healthcare records, we got a bigger problem. So you have to weigh the data. You have to have an understanding. And a lot of organizations do that already. Your most mature organizations do that. They have a weighting of what the data is, the data streams, and well, we have this type of data, but we're using multi-factor authentication, we're using TLS, we're using this, we're using that, we're secure, etc. We're end-to-end encryption. So when you do those things, obviously you're decreasing the risk. So it might not actually be based on the amount of records of the type of controls you have in place. So it's important that you have to take everything together in the aggregate. There is no silver bullet. I'll just tell you that. There's no silver bullet. There's no one size fits all. So, in terms of weighting, it could be something as simple as what do we place, looking through the reputation risk lens, where do we think we need to do this? Because, as I mentioned, it ultimately comes down you don't want to impede the business from doing what they do best, which is offering that service or that product to the public.
And so once they've done that, once they've gone through that process, they've weighted the risks. They feel like they've found an outsourcing provider. They've started to negotiate the contracts. They've budgeted correctly to give them not just a good cost saving, but also they've left money in the budget to be doing external or internal assurance activities. But how should they decide what parts? Because of course there's multiple different domains within IT. It's not just a single aspect. How do they decide what parts they should outsource and what parts they outsource to India, what parts they retain within North America or within Europe? How do they go through that process?
That's where the due diligence comes in. I think once you're done with the due diligence, you can then make the determination as to is this something we are comfortable with offshoring, or can we use the vendor but we have to keep it onshore? I've seen organizations that are saying no, nope, this data, anything that is sensitive, whether it's intellectual property or whether it's customer information, must be done onshore. Usually, when they say that, it's because of legal ramifications. Whether it's European law, European Union law, or whether it's U.S. law. That's why they'll make that decision. And it's about containment. If something were to happen, it's easier to contain and work with authorities, work with regulators, and such. And so that's where the decision is made to we're going to keep this here. Yes, we know we're going to pay more, but we know through the insurance lens, through the reputation lens, it's better for us to say that these records were mishandled or whatever the case may be here in the US, and we have all authorities working on it, then something happened in China, something happened in, any other part of the world, Ukraine, whatever the case may be.
Now, whether it's DORA, whether it's NIS2, whether it's SOC, there's
Mhm.
increasing expectations on companies, especially around ICT and third party risk management. And I think we've unpacked that and discussed that a lot. But I'm wondering, you work in the space, you advise companies, and of course, that means sometimes you're seeing some really interesting things that companies are doing themselves as well as your peers and competitors. What are some of the practical changes? What are the things that you're seeing that are exciting you or that are impressing you when you see how organizations are monitoring, assessing, and challenging their technology providers?
One of the things that they're doing much more that they haven't done much in the past is they're actually saying, we're going to do a pen test on you. A lot of organizations don't like that. It's like, oh, no, 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 no. I'll share with you my pen test results. No, we want to do it. We're going to get a provider of our choosing to do a pen test on you because we want to make sure your environment is solid. That's becoming much more commonplace. I can tell you 10 years ago, it was like, I'm not sharing this with you. And what they would do is they would give you an executive letter, signed off by the CISO saying, I can attest that we have solid controls, and I did that once. I actually had, and I can understand this. I'm sure you would know the vendor, but when I tried to get the results, their geographical CISO reached out to me and he said, Tom, let me explain to you what we do. We have a global practice outside of our organization that actually does Tiger Team services. We have a blue team and a red team and all that. So what we'll do is he said the Asia Pacific will hack the Middle East. The Middle Eastern team will hack South America. South American team will hack Europe. Europe will hack the US. And they do it for prizes and all that stuff, internal bragging rights or maybe even money. And what he said to me was, I can't share with you those results, but I can attest that there was nothing material that affected your data. And I said, can I get that in writing? And I did. So I got it in writing and I was able to use that. What a lot of people fail to understand too is what we do or what third party risk is, it's a due diligence activity. It's not an audit, it's a due diligence activity. And the purpose of that due diligence activity is in the event something goes wrong, you can go into a court of law and say, I did my homework. So it's no different than if you want to purchase a certain financial security, a stock or a bond or something like that. You're not just going to go purchase it because your neighbor said, hey, you should look into this. Okay, and then buy it. You want to say, why would I buy this? They've been in the red for 6 years. You got to ask those questions. And that's what due diligence is. But you got to have you have to put those guardrails around your due diligence.
Excellent. No, I appreciate that, Tom, and I think that's really sage and timely advice. And one question we ask all guests on the International Risk Podcast, and you can go as broad as you want. You can talk about the environment, geopolitics, democracy, whatever the case may be. When you look around the world, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
I've been saying this for many, many years. The one that scares me the most is the geopolitical risk going on in the South China Sea. That's the one that scares me the most. And I'm not just talking about the trade routes that go through that whole geographic region. You're affecting everything from doing business in India. You're doing business, obviously, with Taiwan, with the chips and everything. If you're relying on third party vendors in the Philippines, in India, in Indonesia, etc., these chips are going to supply those organizations, right? They're going to supply those organizations. And if they don't get there, what are you going to do? So that's why you're seeing a lot of organizations now that are actually starting to onshore critical platforms and critical systems or nearshore, something that's more in our hemisphere here in the US. They're more comfortable doing things in Costa Rica or Puerto Rico, which is a US territory. Places like that, because of the risks in the South China Sea, that they don't want to have disruption down there, service disruption, and how that can affect that. So, I think that's the big one. And a lot of the things too is people need to start taking a look at maps. I can't tell you how many organizations I've talked to had no idea that they had an instance in the Ukraine when Russia moved in there 4 years ago. They had no idea. And it's like, well, I didn't know we had something going on in the Ukraine. Why didn't you tell me? And that's where it gets back to, do you know where your data is?
Hmm.
And they fully didn't. They fully didn't. So that's why it's so important.
No, that's excellent, Tom. Well, look, thanks very much for explaining that. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk Podcast today.
I appreciate your time, Dominic. Thank you so much for the invite.
Well, that was a great conversation with Tom Garrubba. He's a leading expert in third-party risk, external party assurance, and supply governance. And he's a co-founder and chief commercial officer at Fusion Air. Really appreciated the conversation with Tom today. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We will speak again in the next couple of days.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the International Risk Podcast. For more episodes and articles, visit theinternationalriskpodcast.com. Follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky and Instagram for the latest updates and to ask your questions to our host, Dominic Bowen. See you next time.